Another objection to the ontological argument comes from a scholar who you might not expect, Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas, as you should remember, was influenced by the ancient Greek empiricist scholar Aristotle. Aquinas proposed natural theology, which means that he felt that we can obtain knowledge about God and about ethics by observing God's creation and using reason to come to conclusions about his existence and his nature. Whilst we've heard some of the vocabulary of the ontological argument in Aquinas' third way, these two arguments are still different. This is because the cosmological argument has its basis in a posteriori reasoning, whereas the ontological argument is purely a priori. Scholars like Descartes and Anselm rejected empirical evidence and natural theology as flawed, instead seeking to obtain knowledge via reason alone. The main reason for Aquinas' objection to the ontological argument is that it's intellectually arrogant to assume that reason alone can lead us to truth. Aquinas' brand of reasoning did in the end fall back on revelation, in divine law. Here, the ontological argument assumes that my conception of God is accurate, yet we humans are flawed, as we were subject to the fall from grace via Adam and Eve. Since we have fallen from God's grace, we cannot trust our reason to dictate the concept of God and thus his existence. Anselm assumes that my concept of God leads me to know that he must exist, but I am flawed and capable of conceiving that God does not exist. This may be an erroneous conception, and thus any conception I have is potentially inaccurate. It needs to be supported by something else, some other kind of evidence. Clearly, not all people are convinced by the ontological argument. There are still atheists, and it is clear that we don't all share in Anselm's definition of God. If the argument had been a strong one, then clearly we would all be convinced and God would be self-evident. For Aquinas, much like other atheist scholars such as Hume have argued, God's existence is a synthetic concept. You cannot demonstrate that God exists unless by using empirical evidence. To say that something exists is to say that it has a reality. It cannot be said that something exists unless demonstrated by empirical evidence. For Aquinas, he has done this in his 5 ways. Anselm has made something that we might describe as a transitional error in his argument. He has moved from an is of definition to an is of existence. This is invalid, as the reasoning for doing so isn't present in his argument. Understanding the term God means only that God exists in the understanding, not in reality as well.